The autumn mist hung thick over the Danube on October 6, 1805, like a shroud waiting to claim its victim. General Karl Mack von Leiberich stood at the window of his headquarters in Ulm, watching the fog roll through the medieval streets below. He should have felt secure. Behind him lay one of the most fortified positions in southern Germany. Before him stretched supply lines reaching back to Austria, and around him gathered 72,000 of the Austrian Empire's finest soldiers. The fortress city of Ulm was impregnable, or so every military manual insisted. What Mack couldn't know as he sipped his morning coffee and reviewed his maps, was that he was already dead. He just hadn't stopped moving yet. 300 miles to the west, another man studied maps by candlelight. Napoleon Bonaparte had turned 36 just 3 months earlier, and the weight of an empire rested on his narrow shoulders. The English Channel had defeated him. The British Navy had humiliated him at Trafalgar just days before, though he didn't know it yet. The combined forces of Austria and Russia were mobilizing to crush his empire while it was still young and vulnerable. Every conventional military mind in Europe expected him to defend the Rhine, to meet the Austrian advance head-on in the time-honored tradition of European warfare. They expected him to do what generals had done for 1,000 years, choose good ground, form his lines, and let men die in their thousands until one side broke. Napoleon had other ideas. The problem was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Mack's army sat astride the traditional invasion routes into France, positioned to link up with Russian forces advancing from the east. Together, they would form an unstoppable hammer that would smash Bonaparte's pretensions to empire. The Austrian general had done everything by the book, which was precisely his mistake. He had read the same books as everyone else. Napoleon had written his own. On October 7th, the Grande Armée began to move. Not toward Ulm, but around it. 190,000 men in 7 corps, strung out across 200 miles of German countryside, began a dance of such precision and daring that military historians would study it for the next 2 centuries. They didn't march in the ponderous columns of traditional armies. They moved like water, like mercury, flowing through gaps in the Austrian intelligence network that Mack didn't even know existed. Marshal Lannes drove north of Ulm. Marshal Ney swung wide to the south. Marshal Bernadotte threaded through neutral Prussian territory with the delicacy of a man defusing a bomb. And Marshal Murat, the cavalry commander who dressed like a peacock and fought like a demon, ranged ahead of them all, his scouts reading the land like prophets reading omens. Mack received his first reports of French movement on October 8th. The news was confusing, contradictory. French forces spotted here, then there, moving in directions that made no sense. His staff officers clustered around the maps, moving colored pins with increasing frustration. The French were supposed to be in front of them, defending Strasbourg and the Rhine crossings. Instead, they seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, like smoke and wind. A lieutenant suggested they might be attempting to flank Ulm to the north. An older colonel laughed at the impossibility of moving such a large force through the Black Forest. Mack listened to both and decided the reports were exaggerated, the product of nervous scouts seeing ghosts in the autumn mist. He ordered increased patrols and returned to his dinner. The meal was excellent. The wine was from a very good year. What Mack couldn't see, what no single observer could see, was the terrible beauty of Napoleon's design. The French weren't marching to Ulm at all. They were marching past it, behind it, between Mack's army and Vienna, between Mack's army and the Russian reinforcements that represented his only hope of victory. Every corps moved on a different road, separated by just enough distance that they couldn't be caught in a single engagement, yet close enough to concentrate within hours if threatened. They lived off the land, requisitioning food from German villages with the efficiency of locusts and the discipline of clockwork. They moved faster than any army that size had ever moved before, covering distances that should have exhausted them, but somehow didn't. The secret was simple. Napoleon had spent years drilling them to march, not just walk. Every step was measured, every rest calculated, and every water source mapped in advance. They were an army that moved like a machine, and the machine was devouring space itself. By October 11th, the trap was beginning to close. Marshal Soult's corps had crossed the Danube at Dounavert, 30 miles east of Ulm. The Austrian garrison there had fought bravely and died quickly, and now French soldiers controlled the bridges that should have been Mock's escape route. To the north, Ney and Lons were swinging around to cut the roads to Stuttgart. To the south, Murat's cavalry was a wall of horses and sabers between Ulm and the Austrian homeland. The noose was tightening, but it was a strange noose, one that seemed to offer escape routes even as it closed. Napoleon understood something that Mock didn't. A trapped animal fights with the fury of desperation, but an animal that thinks it can escape will waste precious time looking for the way out. The first real panic in Ulm came on October 12th, when a cavalry patrol failed to return, then another, then a third. Mock sent out stronger forces, whole squadrons of Austrian cavalry, proud men on beautiful horses, wearing uniforms that looked magnificent and offered no protection against French carbines. They found Murat's horsemen waiting, and what followed wasn't a battle, but a lesson in why cavalry charges only work when the enemy cooperates. The Austrian squadrons broke themselves against French squares, lost a quarter of their number, and limped back to Ulm with news that Mock's hands shook when he held the dispatch. The French were behind them. Across the Danube, between Ulm and Vienna, the trap had sprung. But Mock was no coward, and he was no fool, despite what history would say about him later. He had 72,000 soldiers, strong walls, and enough supplies to last months if necessary. More importantly, he had time. The Russian army under Kutuzov was marching west, 60,000 men who would arrive in weeks if not days. All Mock had to do was hold, make Napoleon come to him, bleed the French army white against Ulm's fortifications, and wait for the Russians to hit Napoleon from behind. It was the sensible plan, the plan any reasonable commander would choose. So on October 13th, Mock made his decision. They would stay in Ulm and defend it. Napoleon learned of this decision the same day and smiled. It was exactly what he wanted. The next week was an agony of slow realization for the Austrians trapped in Ulm. Each day brought new reports of French positions, and each report made it clearer that escape was becoming impossible. To the east, Soult's corps had fortified the Danube crossings and was digging in like they planned to stay forever. To the north, Ney had taken the town of Günzburg after a sharp fight that left the road to Stuttgart closed. To the south, Murat's cavalry patrolled in such strength that Austrian scouts stopped even trying to probe in that direction. And from the west, from the direction of France, where Mock had expected the French to stay, came nothing but silence. Napoleon had left a single corps under Lons to watch Ulm from the west, just enough force to prevent a breakout, but not enough to tempt Mock to attacking. It was the most sophisticated siege in history, one conducted not with trenches and artillery, but with pure maneuver, with the threat of force rather than force itself. Inside Ulm, the mood shifted from confidence to concern, to something approaching dread. Soldiers stood on the walls and watched French campfires multiply in the hills around them, like stars coming out at twilight. Supplies that were supposed to last months started to look finite, countable, consumable. Officers who were certain of victory began studying their maps with a desperate intensity, looking for the escape route that must exist, that had to exist because the alternative was unthinkable. And Mock, proud Mock, confident Mock, began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. He had expected a battle. Napoleon had given him a prison. On October 14th, Mock made his first attempt to break out. He sent 6,000 men under General Riesch to force a passage north, to punch through Ney's positions and open the road to Stuttgart. The attack was brave and well planned, and completely futile. Ney's forces met them at Haslach, and what followed was a small battle that demonstrated everything that made the French army so dangerous. The French didn't stand and receive the Austrian attack like soldiers on a parade ground. They moved, they flowed, they concentrated overwhelming force at the point of contact and then dispersed when the Austrians and respond. Ney himself was nearly captured when he rode too far forward, saved only by the quick thinking of a handful of grenadiers who formed square around him and fought their way back to friendly lines. But the attack failed. Riche lost a third of his force and limped back to Ulm with news that the northern route was closed. The walls seemed higher after that, the sky smaller.
October 15th through 17th passed in an agony of indecision. Mack knew he needed to move, but every direction seemed blocked. Every option seemed to end in disaster. His staff officers argued in urgent whispers about which route offered the best chance of escape, but they were arguing about flavors of poison. To the east meant fighting through Soult's fortified positions with the entire French army able to concentrate against them. To the north meant facing Ney again, and Ney had proven he could hold. To the south, Murat waited with enough cavalry to run down any column that tried to force march through open country. And to the west, back toward France, Lannes sat like a spider in a web, weak enough to tempt an attack, but strong enough to hold until reinforcements arrived. Every option was a trap. The whole situation was a trap. Mack began to realize that Napoleon hadn't outthought him. Napoleon had outthought him, had anticipated every move and countermove, and had positioned his forces so that every decision Mack made would be wrong. The rain began on October 18th, cold autumn rain that turned the roads to mud and made campfires sputter and die. In his headquarters, Mack made a decision born of desperation. They would break out to the north again, but this time with the main force. 30,000 men in a massive column that would smash through anything in its path. It was a gamble, but sitting in Ulm was a guaranteed loss, and at least movement offered the illusion of control. The orders went out, be ready to march on October 19th. Every man, every gun, every wagon. They would punch through to Heidenheim and from there to the Russian lines. It was possible. It had to be possible. Napoleon learned of the planned breakout from his scouts before Mack's own soldiers knew about it. The French intelligence network was so good, so pervasive, that Austrian officers joked bitterly that Bonaparte probably read their mail before they did. The emperor studied the reports and issued new orders with the calm precision of a chess master seeing checkmate in 3 moves. Ney was to hold position and appear weak, to invite the attack. Murat was to swing north with his cavalry, ready to fall on the Austrian column's flank. Soult would advance from the east, closing the back door, and Lannes would press from the west, not hard enough to prevent the breakout, but hard enough to make sure no one stayed behind to defend Ulm. It was beautiful and it was brutal, and it would work. The breakout began at dawn on October 19th. 30,000 Austrian soldiers, the best Mack had, marched out of Ulm toward the northern hills where Ney waited. They moved in good order, professional soldiers who had drilled for this, who knew their business. The rain had stopped and the autumn sun was almost warm on their backs. For a few hours, it seemed like the plan might work. The advance guard encountered light resistance, French skirmishers who fired a few shots and fell back. The main column deployed into battle formation, artillery unlimbered, cavalry spread out to guard the flanks. They were doing everything right, and it meant nothing. Ney's main force was waiting in the hills beyond Elchinger, positioned on ground of his own choosing with artillery sighted to turn the river valley into a killing ground. When the Austrian advance guard came into view, the French guns opened fire with a roar that echoed off the hillsides like thunder. Solid shot plowed through the Austrian ranks, iron balls that killed by physics and terror in equal measure. The Austrians deployed, returned fire, tried to force a crossing of the Danube tributary that stood between them and escape. What followed was 4 hours of savage fighting, the kind of battle that Napoleon had wanted to avoid, but was more than willing to win if it came to him. French infantry held the bridges, died on the bridges, held again. Austrian cavalry tried to flank, met French cavalry and discovered that Murat's men didn't just look pretty in their gaudy uniforms, they could fight like demons when the situation required it. By noon, the breakout had stalled. By mid-afternoon, it had failed. Mack's 30,000 men were falling back toward Ulm, bloodied and exhausted, having achieved nothing except confirming that escape to the north was impossible. They lost 4,000 men, killed or wounded or simply vanished into the confusion of battle. And for what? A few miles of mud and a lesson in why Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of Europe. But the real disaster came from a different direction. While Mack had been focused on the breakout, every eye was turned north toward the sound of guns, Murat's cavalry had been moving. They swept around the southern edge of the Austrian position like a scythe through wheat, and behind them came Soul's infantry, 25,000 men who had force-marched through the rain to be in position when they were needed. It was beautiful, and it was brutal, and it would work. October 20th dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that makes you grateful for small warmth and dreading the winter to come. Mack assembled his officers for a council of war that everyone knew was really a funeral. The numbers were simple and terrible. They'd lost 6,000 men in the failed breakouts. They had food for perhaps 2 more weeks. The French had them surrounded with a force that grew larger every day as more corps arrived from their wide-ranging maneuvers. And the Russians who were supposed to save them, were still weeks away and getting farther every day as Napoleon's other corps pursued them east. There was no good option anymore. There wasn't even a bad option that offered hope. But still they tried. On October 21st, a final attempted breakout, this time to the east, toward the Austrian homeland. 8,000 men under General Werneck, moving fast and light, trying to slip through Soul's positions before the French could concentrate. It almost worked. They got 15 miles, reached the village of Tröchtelfingen, saw open country ahead and began to believe that escape was possible. Then Murat's cavalry appeared on the horizon like a storm front, and belief died. The chase that followed was less a battle than a hunt. Austrian infantry formed squares and tried to fight their way forward, but cavalry squares are slow and cumbersome, and Murat's horsemen didn't attack them directly. They just followed, pacing the Austrians like wolves pacing wounded prey, waiting for the inevitable. When night fell, Werneck's troops made camp, posted guards, and tried to rest. Most of them couldn't sleep. They knew how this would end. Morning brought French infantry, Soul's corps arriving at a run, fresh and eager and overwhelming. Werneck had no choice but to surrender. 8,000 men laid down their weapons without firing more than a few shots. They had tried everything, done everything right, and it hadn't mattered. Napoleon's trap was too perfect, too complete, too inescapable. Back in Ulm, Mack received the news of Werneck's surrender on October 22nd and finally accepted what he had been refusing to believe for 2 weeks. There would be no escape, no rescue, no miracle. He had 70,000 men trapped in a fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, and they were going to starve there unless he did the one thing every soldier dreads more than death. He would have to surrender. The negotiations began on October 23rd. Napoleon received Mack's emissaries with courtesy and made his terms clear. Unconditional surrender, all forces to lay down their arms, officers to be paroled on their honor not to fight again until properly exchanged. Mack tried to bargain, tried to get better terms, tried to maintain some shred of dignity for himself and his men. Napoleon listened politely and gave him nothing. The Emperor of the French knew he held every card, and he was not inclined to be generous to a man who had made him work this hard. What followed was one of the strangest interludes of the entire campaign. Mack asked for 8 days to send word to Vienna and receive orders from his emperor on whether to surrender. Napoleon, incredibly, agreed. Not out of kindness, but out of calculated self-interest. Every day that Mack's army sat in Ulm was another day it wasn't marching to join the Russians. Every Austrian soldier counting rations in a besieged city was one less soldier fighting French forces in the east. Napoleon could afford to wait. He had all the time in the world. Those 8 days in Ulm must have been surreal for the soldiers trapped there. They knew they were defeated, knew they would surrender, but they still had to maintain discipline, still had to stand watch and drill and pretend that military order meant something. French and Austrian sentries stood within shouting distance of each other, sometimes trading tobacco or newspapers, sometimes just watching each other in silence. Officers from both sides met under flags of truce to discuss the technical details of the coming surrender with the careful politeness of men planning a funeral. And over it all hung the autumn sky, growing colder each day, reminding everyone that winter was coming, and none of them wanted to be campaigning when it arrived.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Napoleon used those 8 days to consolidate his victory and prepare for what came next. His corps spread out across southern Germany, occupying key cities, securing supply lines, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Russian army that was still retreating eastward. He issued proclamations to the German people, promising liberation from Austrian domination, hinting at a new order in Europe with France at its center. He reviewed his troops, thousands of men who had just pulled off one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history. and were already being asked to prepare for the next battle. And he wrote letters to Paris, carefully crafted messages that would manage the news when it arrived, that would turn a brilliant campaign into a legend. October 31st was the day set for the surrender, and Napoleon staged it with all the theatrical flair that made him as much showman as soldier. The entire Austrian garrison marched out of Ulm in formation, bands playing, colors flying, maintaining the fiction of military dignity even in defeat. 72,000 men laid down their weapons in a meadow outside the city, while French troops lined the road and watched in silence. There was no jeering, no celebrating. Napoleon had given strict orders. These men had fought bravely against impossible odds, and they would be treated with respect. Besides, some of them would be fighting for France soon enough. Conquered soldiers made excellent conscripts. Mack himself surrendered his sword to Napoleon personally in a ceremony that was witnessed by thousands and remembered by history. The Austrian general was in his full dress uniform, every button polished, every decoration in place, maintaining appearances even though everyone knew his career was over. Napoleon accepted the sword with slight bow, said something quietly that no one else heard, and handed the weapon to an aide. Later accounts would claim the emperor had been magnanimous in victory, had praised Mack's courage and skill. But those who were close enough to watch said Napoleon's face was cold, his eyes already focused on the east where the real campaign was waiting. The human cost of Ulm was relatively light in the direct sense, only about 6,000 casualties in actual fighting. But the strategic cost was devastating. Austria had lost an entire army, 72,000 men who would take months to replace, if they could be replaced at all. The road to Vienna lay open, defended only by retreating Russian forces who were beginning to realize that they might be Napoleon's next victims. And the myth of Austrian military supremacy, already damaged by earlier defeats, had been shattered beyond repair. Mack's army hadn't just been defeated, it had been made irrelevant, erased from the strategic map without Napoleon ever having to fight the massive battle that everyone had expected. But the real lesson of Ulm had nothing to do with tactics or strategy in the narrow sense. What Napoleon demonstrated in those October weeks was something more fundamental about the nature of war itself. For centuries, European armies had fought in essentially the same way. They found each other, they formed lines, they killed each other until one side broke. Commanders were judged by their courage in battle, their ability to stand firm under fire, their willingness to sacrifice men for victory. Napoleon showed that there was another way, a better way. Don't fight the enemy's strength. Attack his weakness. Don't seek battle. Seek position. Don't kill his soldiers. Trap them. Make them surrender not because they've been defeated, but because continuing to fight would be pointless. Modern military theorists call it maneuver warfare, but that antiseptic term doesn't capture the psychological brilliance of what Napoleon did at Ulm. He didn't just outmaneuver Mack, he outthought him, anticipated him, got inside his decision-making cycle, and stayed there. Every choice Mack made seemed reasonable at the time, but was actually exactly what Napoleon wanted him to do. Stay in Ulm? Perfect, that makes you easier to surround. Try to break out north? Excellent, that's where I'm strongest. Send forces east? Wonderful, I'll bag them separately. It was war as chess, but chess where your opponent knows what move you're going to make before you make it. The campaign didn't end at Ulm, of course. Napoleon would go on to fight the Russians and win the staggering victory at Austerlitz just weeks later, the battle he called his finest work. But Austerlitz was only possible because Ulm had already been won. The Austrian army that should have been fighting alongside the Russians was gone, captured without a climactic battle, removed from the board by pure maneuver. And the myth of Austrian military supremacy, already damaged by earlier defeats, had been shattered beyond repair. Mack's army hadn't just been defeated, it had been made irrelevant, erased from the strategic map without Napoleon ever having to fight the massive battle that everyone had expected. But the real lesson of Ulm had nothing to do with tactics or strategy in the narrow sense. What Napoleon demonstrated in those October weeks was something more fundamental about the nature of war itself. For centuries, European armies had fought in essentially the same way. They found each other, they formed lines, they killed each other until one side broke. Commanders were judged by their courage in battle, their ability to stand firm under fire, their willingness to sacrifice men for victory. Napoleon showed that there was another way, a better way. Don't fight the enemy's strength. Attack his weakness. Don't seek battle. Seek position. Don't kill his soldiers. Trap them. Make them surrender not because they've been defeated, but because continuing to fight would be pointless. Modern military theorists call it maneuver warfare, but that antiseptic term doesn't capture the psychological brilliance of what Napoleon did at Ulm. He didn't just outmaneuver Mack, he outthought him, anticipated him, got inside his decision-making cycle, and stayed there. Every choice Mack made seemed reasonable at the time, was actually exactly what Napoleon wanted him to do. Stay in Ulm? Perfect, that makes you easier to surround. Try to break out north? Excellent, that's where I'm strongest. Send forces east? Wonderful, I'll bag them separately. It was war as chess, but chess where your opponent knows what move you're going to make before you make it. The campaign didn't end at Ulm, of course. Napoleon would go on to fight the Russians and win the staggering victory at Austerlitz just weeks later, the battle he called his finest work. But Austerlitz was only possible because Ulm had already been won. The Austrian army that should have been fighting alongside the Russians was gone, captured without a climactic battle, removed from the board by pure maneuver. And the myth of Austrian military supremacy, already damaged by earlier defeats, had been shattered beyond repair. Mack's army hadn't just been defeated, it had been made irrelevant, erased from the strategic map without Napoleon ever having to fight the massive battle that everyone had expected. But the real lesson of Ulm had nothing to do with tactics or strategy in the narrow sense. What Napoleon demonstrated in those October weeks was something more fundamental about the nature of war itself. For centuries, European armies had fought in essentially the same way. They found each other, they formed lines, they killed each other until one side broke. Commanders were judged by their courage in battle, their ability to stand firm under fire, their willingness to sacrifice men for victory. Napoleon showed that there was another way, a better way. Don't fight the enemy's strength. Attack his weakness. Don't seek battle. Seek position. Don't kill his soldiers. Trap them. Make them surrender not because they've been defeated, but because continuing to fight would be pointless. Modern military theorists call it maneuver warfare, but that antiseptic term doesn't capture the psychological brilliance of what Napoleon did at Ulm. He didn't just outmaneuver Mack, he outthought him, anticipated him, got inside his decision-making cycle, and stayed there. Every choice Mack made seemed reasonable at the time, but was actually exactly what Napoleon wanted him to do. Stay in Ulm? Perfect, that makes you easier to surround. Try to break out north? Excellent, that's where I'm strongest. Send forces east? Wonderful, I'll bag them separately. It was war as chess, but chess where your opponent knows what move you're going to make before you make it. The campaign didn't end at Ulm, of course. Napoleon would go on to fight the Russians and win the staggering victory at Austerlitz just weeks later, the battle he called his finest work. But Austerlitz was only possible because Ulm had already been won. The Austrian army that should have been fighting alongside the Russians was gone, captured without a climactic battle, removed from the board by pure maneuver. And the myth of Austrian military supremacy, already damaged by earlier defeats, had been shattered beyond repair. Mack's army hadn't just been defeated, it had been made irrelevant, erased from the strategic map without Napoleon ever having to fight the massive battle that everyone had expected. But the real lesson of Ulm had nothing to do with tactics or strategy in the narrow sense. What Napoleon demonstrated in those October weeks was something more fundamental about the nature of war itself. For centuries, European armies had fought in essentially the same way. They found each other, they formed lines, they killed each other until one side broke. Commanders were judged by their courage in battle, their ability to stand firm under fire, their willingness to sacrifice men for victory. Napoleon showed that there was another way, a better way. Don't fight the enemy's strength. Attack his weakness. Don't seek battle. Seek position. Don't kill his soldiers. Trap them. Make them surrender not because they've been defeated, but because continuing to fight would be pointless. Modern military theorists call it maneuver warfare, but that antiseptic term doesn't capture the psychological brilliance of what Napoleon did at Ulm. He didn't just outmaneuver Mack, he outthought him, anticipated him, got inside his decision-making cycle, and stayed there. Every choice Mack made seemed reasonable at the time, but was actually exactly what Napoleon wanted him to do. Stay in Ulm? Perfect. That makes you easier to surround. Try to break out north? Excellent. That's where I'm strongest.
Send forces east. Wonderful. I'll bag them separately. It was war as chess, but chess where your opponent knows what move you're going to make before you make it. The campaign didn't end at Ulm, of course. Napoleon would go on to fight the Russians and win the staggering victory at Austerlitz just weeks later, the battle he called his finest work. But Austerlitz was only possible because Ulm had already been won. The Austrian army that should have been fighting alongside the Russians was gone, captured without a climactic battle, removed from the board by pure maneuver. And the psychological impact of Ulm rippled through every court in Europe. If Napoleon could trap and destroy a 70,000-man army without really fighting it, what couldn't he do? There's a deeper lesson here that transcends military history, one that applies to any competitive endeavor where smart beats strong and forethought beats force. Mack failed not because he was incompetent or cowardly. He failed because he was conventional. He did what every military manual told him to do, positioned his forces where the textbooks said they should be, made decisions that any reasonable officer would have made. His mistake was assuming that his opponent would play by the same rules, would fight the same kind of war that European powers had been fighting for generations. Napoleon refused to play that game. He invented a new one. And by the time Mack realized what was happening, the new rules had already trapped him. In our own time, we see the same pattern repeat in business, in technology, in politics. The established players do everything right according to the old playbook and still lose to newcomers who are playing a different game entirely. The music industry did everything conventional wisdom said was right and still got disrupted by digital distribution. Taxi companies operated efficiently and profitably and still got blindsided by ride-sharing apps. Traditional media followed all the established best practices and still lost audiences to social platforms that didn't even exist a decade earlier. Like Mack at Ulm, they weren't defeated by superior force. They were made irrelevant by superior positioning, by competitors who rewrote the rules while they were still reading the old manual. The tragedy of Mack's situation was that he never really had a chance. From the moment Napoleon set the Grande Armée in motion, from the moment those 7 corps began their dance across southern Germany, the outcome was determined. Everything that happened afterward was just the working out of consequences that had already been set in motion. Mack's breakout attempts, his desperate maneuvers, his hopes for Russian rescue, all of it was just a man flailing against currents he couldn't see and couldn't escape. Napoleon had positioned his forces so perfectly that Mack was checkmate before he even knew the game had started. But there's something almost admirable about Mack's refusal to accept the inevitable, his insistence on trying every option even when they all led to the same place. He could have surrendered on October 14th when the trap first closed and saved his men the suffering of those final weeks. He chose to fight instead, to try, to hope that somehow military courage and determination could overcome strategic brilliance. It couldn't. And that's the hard truth that Ulm teaches us. Courage without wisdom is just elaborate suicide. Determination without strategy is just stubborn defeat. And fighting bravely for a lost cause doesn't make it any less lost. When Mack returned to Vienna after his parole, he faced a court-martial that convicted him of incompetence and sentenced him to 2 years in prison. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his name forever associated with one of history's most complete defeats. It was brutally unfair in some ways. Mack had faced Napoleon Bonaparte at the height of his powers and lost, just like almost everyone else who tried. But history is written by winners, and winners don't give credit to the men they beat. Napoleon got the glory, Mack got the blame, and 72,000 soldiers got to go home defeated but alive, saved from dying in a battle that never happened because Napoleon found a better way. The ultimate irony of Ulm is that it's largely forgotten today while battles like Austerlitz and Waterloo remain famous. People remember where armies clashed and men died by the thousands. They forget the campaign where genius made battle unnecessary, where maneuver replaced massacre, where the ultimate victory came from fighting the right war rather than fighting the wrong one brilliantly. Maybe that's human nature.
We glorify the dramatic, the violent, the moments when everything hangs on courage and luck and the roll of the dice. We overlook the quiet brilliance of simply being in the right place when your enemy is in the wrong one. But for those who study it, who really understand what Napoleon accomplished in those October weeks of 1805, Ulm represents something more perfect than any battlefield victory could be. It's war as art rather than butchery, strategy as chess rather than dice, victory through thought rather than blood. An entire army neutralized, a campaign decided, the course of European history altered, and all of it accomplished not by how many men died, but where they marched. That's the real lesson of Ulm, that one that echoes across the centuries to anyone who will listen. The best victory is the one where you never have to fight at all.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.